one of the groups that lobbied for the Cesar sanctions was the White Helmets. We're told they're humanitarians. They were recently nominated again for a Nobel Prize by this pro-Israel fanatic in Canada named Erwin Kotler, who helped organize their evacuation by the Israeli intelligence services through Jordan. The point I was just going to make is that the White Helmets have played a role in the misery, the immiseration of average Syrians. And under sanctions, as in every other country, the only people who suffer are the working class. So you really see not just the physical fragmentation of society where you get to drive through kilometers of areas that have been destroyed, but the psychological fragmentation and the personal fragmentation where everybody my age that I spoke to who is well educated or younger, every single one would say, I'm the only one of my friends who's still in the country. Yeah. Or I only have one friend left in the country. Everybody else has left. Mm-hmm. They would say, Syria has become such a lonely place. So they're having this massive brain drain,
like in Venezuela,
which is affecting society at every level.
One person that we talked to had also served in the military. He really seemed to believe that the true death count of the Syrian soldiers was much higher than we're led to believe, or that's officially on record. And I just hope that one day we get the full, a true account.
Because half the guys in his barrack were killed.
Yeah, he said 5 of his close immediate friends were killed. And so just based on his own experience, if you multiply that by the number of different battalions or whatever you would call it.
He said that there were twins in his barrack and they were murdered on a roadside by their aunt's husband. Mm-hmm. And they were Alawite twins, but their aunt's husband was Sunni, and he became infected with a lot of the sectarian propaganda that was being pumped in by networks like Al Jazeera, Orient TV and whatnot. And he just decided to kill them one day.
I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the truly moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
Moderate
rebels.
This is Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton, and this is part 2 of my discussion with my co-host Max Blumenthal, and also with Anya Parampil, a reporter and our colleague at The Gray Zone. The two of them just got back from a 10-day trip to Syria, where they were reporting on the ground on the effects of the international proxy war on this independent Middle Eastern post-colonial country. In the first part of our episode, they talked about what life was like, the hell of life under so-called rebels, these Salafi jihadists, these Islamist extremists who were backed by foreign governments and who wreaked havoc across Syria. In this part, we're going to talk about how the war is continuing by other means, with crippling economic sanctions and a psychological warfare aimed collectively at the entire civilian population of Syria. Here is part 2 of our discussion.
The corruption. I mean, we heard about corruption in the government and everybody's complaining about corruption. Pretty much everywhere I go, everybody's complaining about corruption. But, the corruption.
Never in Washington for some reason.
Well, it's legal in the U.S.
Yeah, it's just.
You just legalize it.
But the corruption of
it's
these
freedom.
Groups was, to the point where they would loot any holy site. They just looted everything.
Oh, yeah.
Well, and it makes sense now that people would criticize corruption because when you are dealing with a war situation, you're worried about your life. You can't work. You have, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You have other more important priorities, and now that people actually have a relatively stable life and security, they can go back to focusing about the economic situation. Let's talk about that.
Sanctions make it. Sanctions always empower the most corrupt elements.
Well,
of
exactly.
Any
And even if someone is not necessarily corrupt and they're good at heart, whatever that means. I mean, corruption is a social issue. It's a political problem. It's not just that people are inherently evil and they're all inherently corrupt. It's that the economic situation is difficult. And let's talk more about this. It's similar in Venezuela. People talk about corruption nonstop. And, it's not like corruption doesn't exist. Of course, they never talk about corruption in Colombia,
They never talk about efforts of the government to address corruption either.
But also, it makes sense that corruption is becoming worse because the economic situation is becoming worse. And if you're a cop or a soldier or whatever,
you're a major importer. If you control the market, you benefit from sanctions because
all I'm saying is, I'm saying something different. I'm saying that it makes sense that individuals might be more inclined to engage in corruption because their lives have become more difficult thanks to the sanctions and the economic war. So let's just talk more about that situation. I mean, what you talked a bit about the inflation. Like there's massive inflation going on. The U.S. and also the EU are imposing more and more aggressive forms of sanctions as a new form of regime change, attempt of regime change. How has this impacted the civilian population?
Well, Syria is different from Venezuela in the sense that it, for decades, was not solely a petrol state, the way Venezuela was before the revolution. So Syria produces a lot domestically, whether it's food or any material goods. They're unfortunately, one of their industrial hearts, their center, Aleppo, was completely destroyed. And looted. And all of that equipment was moved to Turkey, which happened to be Aleppo, Syria's main competitor, which people speak openly and they're very aware of that fact. They feel as though Aleppo was purposely targeted by Turkish-backed armed groups to rob Syria of its industrial supremacy and development, and just totally sent to Turkey. And in spite of that, there still is a lot of domestic production which counteracts the sanctions in a way where Venezuela is not really in that position, really because of their history. Like we have said before, Venezuela was a petrol state. It was all built around oil production for decades.
For 100 years.
For hundreds of years before, or 100 years.
In Syria, talk about the oil shortages.
Yeah, something that's just so stunning to think about is that somehow the center of Syria's oil production is one of the only areas left still controlled by foreign-backed groups. It's the Kurdish region.
Which also have
Kurdish-controlled region.
Which also have a dozen U.S. military bases.
Exactly, and the Kurds have acted as an extension of the U.S. military.
So the U.S. military just so happens to occupy the oil-rich region of Syria.
So Syria can't buy its own oil, and it's been robbed of that wealth.
Well, I wrote an article
previously
about this.
occupied by ISIS, which was also in many ways a U.S. confection.
Yes, and it was all of the oil was being shipped to Turkey over the border. Turkey was enabling the sale of stolen oil on the international market. That's all documented. Yeah.
Doing business with ISIS and supporting it. And I wrote an article at the Gray Zone about some of the discussion in Washington, specifically this former U.S. government apparatchik who worked at the Pentagon's major university and is now at a D.C. think tank, and wrote about how the Kurdish forces that are allied with the U.S., the YPG/SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, how they should use oil and also bread as a weapon against Damascus, the central government. And specifically, he was discussing how the Syrian government is offering higher prices of oil to the Kurdish forces because these are Kurdish Syrians and the Syrian government wants them to reincorporate into its state. But
especially once they were thrown under the bus by the United States.
But the U.S. is actually, of course, pressuring them to not sell the Syrian oil they control to the central government and instead sell the oil domestically and to other countries at a lower cost than the subsidized cost that the Syrian government is offering. So they're asking them to shoot themselves in the foot economically. And this D.C. think tank apparatchik that I wrote about said that the U.S. is actively encouraging this policy and also encouraging the use of food importation and food as a weapon, essentially to wage collective warfare against the civilian population.
I mean, there were these deliberate fires in the breadbasket of Syria where Kurds are largely in control, and they were setting fires. and then preventing farmers from exporting to the government or selling their crops to their own government at the normal price. And they would either have to bargain down or just hold on to their crops or export them abroad.
And we should make clear that, I mean, it's not that they're all just the Kurds. These are Kurdish farmers who are being told by the Kurdish political officials that have allied with the U.S. So it's like an inter-Kurdish conflict. It's not like all the Kurds are against the central government. It's that the political leaders have decided to allow the construction of a dozen U.S. military bases in the territory that they control now.
And then you have
then the U.S. still let Turkey go ahead and
exactly
fight them. So maybe then they started to realize a little bit that they'd made a bad bargain.
And then you have the impounding of oil tankers from Iran, which are heading to Syria. Basically, during the winter, oil shortages caused people across Syria to have to ration heating fuel and go through the winter really without heating. There were some scenes of cities paralyzed because there was a gasoline crisis. And, there are now shortages of medical supplies. And then beyond that, the Syrian currency, as in Venezuela, has been devalued to the point where the Syrian consumers' buying power has been destroyed. I mean, it was 45 Syrian pounds to $1 before the war, and when we got there, it was 650. Businessman who we hung out with, who had no connection to the government, said, the U.S. decided that it could push a button and destroy our economy, and it worked. 2019 has been the worst year for us because during the war, there actually was a lot of money flowing into the country, and a lot of the money that went into the insurgent groups, actually, there would be sort of a residual effect where the government would figure out ways to, there was a trickle-down effect into Damascus and government territory. And that's gone, and now the country's under a de facto blockade. And one thing I should mention is that the sanctions are called the Cesar sanctions bill. That's the way they're sold in Congress. They're named after this really shady character, Cesar, who was said to be a military photographer from inside this prison who took smuggled photographs supposedly showing mass extermination by the Assad government. But if you actually examine the photos closely, you'll see that even according to Human Rights Watch, which is officially aligned in support of regime change in Syria, about 50% of those shown in those photographs were Syrian government fighters, either, with groups aligned with the Syrian government or in the Syrian army who had just simply wound up in a mortuary in the hospital. And then beyond that, the identity of this figure, Cesar, is almost impossible to verify. He showed up in Congress, in a shroud, being translated by Muaz Mustafa, who's the guy who took John McCain on his illegal trip to Syria, who is one of the key regime change lobbyists, someone who actually put pressure on bookstores to prevent me from doing my book talk. So the whole operation is really shady. I wrote about some of it in the Gray Zone. But one of the groups that lobbied for the Cesar sanctions was the White Helmets. We're told they're humanitarians. They were recently nominated again for a Nobel Prize by this pro-Israel fanatic in Canada named Erwin Kotler, who helped organize their evacuation by the Israeli intelligence services through Jordan.
And who's also been involved in the campaign against Venezuela, accusing it of crimes against humanity.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he's just a kind of regime change operative using the fraud of the kind of human rights industry to cover up his agenda. But the point I was just going to make is that the White Helmets have played a role in the misery, the immiseration of average Syrians. And under sanctions, as in every other country, the only people who suffer are the working class. But, the government, the Assad family and their inner circle, businessmen like Rami Makhlouf, who are really close to them, they're doing pretty well. They're doing fine. Sanctions don't affect them at all. And there's absolutely no sign that the government is suffering under these brutal sanctions.
The other point to keep in mind about Syria is that people might want to make qualifying statements about the government one way or another. It's not a shining example of democracy, or it's not Venezuela, people might say, but you might agree that democracy is kind of a relative term. We could talk about what democracy in the United States
Jordan,
means.
Saudi Arabia, the UAE,
Right.
great democracy.
Well, even like, what does it mean that we have this two-party system in the United
Exactly,
States
yeah,
that essentially represents?
I mean, that's so obvious. But the point also to make, I mean, I know you're moving to a point, but the point also to make is that you can't compare apples and oranges. You have to look at the region.
Exactly.
And actually, what's the most democratic country in the region? It's actually probably Iran. It's not Israel, that's for sure. It's probably Iran, which is another country that is supposedly the devil incarnate that the U.S. wants to destroy.
And that's part of the point I was making, but...
Or Lebanon, which is a failed state.
That's more to the point which I was making, which is that Syria, you can say whatever you want about the government if you want to go there. I personally don't wish to. But the most important thing to keep in mind is that across the board, people who we talk to would say before the war, Syria was a country at least where people didn't go hungry. People had free healthcare. People had free education. The trash was picked up from the street, unlike Lebanon, for example. And there was a totally functioning state, which actually gave people things more than we get here. I mean, healthcare and education alone is a far-off fantasy for those of us in the States. And so when the war began, that's why even people who we spoke with who were supportive and heavily involved in the initial demonstrations against the government and wanted basic reforms, once they realized that it was a war against the Syrian state, the actual structure which does provide goods and services to the Syrian people, that's when they said we had to back off, and we realized that it was just a totally outside imposed war, a war imposed from the outside on the people of Syria and
on the state itself.
Yeah.
So it was, moving towards a Libya situation.
Yeah, and that's something that I feel like we don't hear about enough in the States. There's a hostility and a closed-mindedness when it comes to discussing what the Syrian state actually stood for.
Well, because to the entire Western corporate media, it's just the Assad regime. It's one henchman, maybe his wife, who, they're all just conspiring, following his orders. And a quick point I wanted to make, what you were discussing with the kind of the war, not just on Syria as a country, but on the state specifically. It reminds me of what the U.S. did in Iraq. And there's so little discussion of what the U.S. actually did in Iraq. It's all just, it was a disaster, it was a failure, if there is that kind of introspection. But after the U.S. Dissolved the army, the most important multi-sectarian, intersectarian institution in the country, after dissolving the entire military, the U.S. imposed Pinochet-style neoliberalism,
shock therapy,
privatizing everything, turning turning Bremer into the unelected king of Iraq, and then just overseeing the massive looting of all of these state industries.
Bringing Heritage Foundation interns into charge of the Iraqi economy and the Iraqi state. And so what the U.S. did was export its own system to the country. That's the catastrophe.
And that's what they wanted. I mean, it wasn't just about removing Assad. And it wasn't
what we did to Russia in the 1990s.
Yeah, right.
And it wasn't just
we always talk about Russia's kleptocracy. No. It's Russia's Americocracy.
Exactly. Well, and the point I'm making is that, of course, there are many reasons that the U.S., Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Europe wanted to remove the Syrian government. It's basically the only country in the region, aside from Iran, that refuses to recognize Israel, that supports Palestinian resistance, that is allied.
The idea of pan-Arabism.
Yeah, I mean, those are all factors, but also the fact that, regardless of the many problems we are talking about with the state, it is still one of the few countries in the region that actually, although neoliberalism has made elements of, and has entered to an extent in the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's one of its major allies.
Right.
Syria still has a very strong state-controlled economy, still very strong state institutions, which very few countries in the region do.
Right. That's why I always like to strongly reject this idea Michael Parenti talks a lot about it too, of the inept empire. People love to, pundits love
The
to say,
bumbling empire.
oh, they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. They just went in there and they destroyed Iraq when they wanted to make like
They
some
didn't go in there.
functioning...
They tripped into the war. They stumbled.
Or
They stumbled into more war.
totally destroying the states and the structure is not an intended outcome of the policy. They're totally happy to have that collapse and for there to be some anarchical chaos.
Well,
Because
Libya.
that's when they can step in and economically assert control in the country, which is a big driving force behind U.S. war.
It's the driving force.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
Libya had one of the highest standards of living in the entire world, for the global south at least, and now it has no state.
And to say, they don't know what they're doing, it's like, how many times do they need to do this before you realize, like, oh, maybe they actually like destroying states?
Well, I think it's more, it is that Joe Biden at the Council on Foreign Relations, which really is like his, marionette on foreign policy. He did this.
You mean he's their marionette?
He's their marionette. They're his ventriloquist or whatever. He did this event with Les Gelb, who just died, who's the old CFR head before Richard Haas, in 2006 about Iraqi confederation, where Iraq would be divided along sectarian lines and would have a weak central government. So they really spelled out the ultimate agenda for Iraq.
Well, and that was also proposed for Syria. They were going to create the Alawite Strip.
Exactly.
And a lot of people said that was in order.
That's also the Israeli agenda too.
Yeah, it's all the same. It's the same agenda. It's balkanize the entire region, carve it up in sectarian lines so they're easily controlled and they will fight among each other so you can just exploit everything.
Like Jamal, like Khashoggi advocated for in the Washington Post, or I think we watched at some television interview where he advocated for Syria to be cut into pieces.
No, Khashoggi wrote an article about that.
Yes.
And by the way,
unfortunate.
Are you saying his demise was a performance piece?
And by the way, did Khashoggi actually write that article? Because the Washington Post...
he can't speak English.
It was written by the Qatar Foundation.
The Qatar Foundation.
He actually can't speak English.
And
Watch
the head
any
of the
interview
Qatar
with him.
Foundation is not even Qatari. It's a white Westerner who is paid by Qatar to write all this propaganda. So it's all the same apparatus.
Since moved on to writing C.J. Werleman's pieces.
Watch any interview with Khashoggi and tell me that he had the English language chops to write in the Washington Post. No, he did not.
Anyway, so Syria sort of survived, and also another aspect of it is the sort of religious and cultural mosaic survived. I went out for tea with a real hardcore, I would say, a young person who's a loyalist, critical, but a loyalist. His grandfather was involved in founding the Syrian army, and he's very proud of his country. He describes, anything the government did as sort of isolated mistakes rather than, as sort of a systematic problem. But one of the things that he emphasized to me, and this is the language that all the loyalists speak, is that, the most important aspect of the state is the mosaic of all of the different religions. And he described it in terms of a rosary. He used a rosary as a metaphor and described the different sects and religious groups as beads on the rosary. And he said that what the armed opposition wanted to do was tear the string apart and have all those beads scatter, and that they were promoting sectarianism. And he said that him and his friends have gone out and made efforts to, reach out to all the different sects and make friends, and that their ultimate goal and the thing that they wanted most was to find a Jewish friend. And he said, but there are only 21 Jews left in Syria. And so, this is a fact that, yes, it's a police state. It's a one-party state. It's a hereditary dictatorship, whatever you want to say. But it's also a pluralistic state. There is pluralism which exists, and
And we didn't even talk about women's rights either.
Well, it's
thing.
almost like you get attacked for saying it because you sound like an Israeli. Like, you have to understand that the Hamas wants to kill the gays, and they don't like lesbians and so on. They do that whole Hasbara shtick. But I want to say that there was a clash of civilizations in Syria. There really was, and we need to acknowledge it. And it's not the clash of civilizations that Samuel Huntington or Daniel Pipes or any of these Islamophobes spell out. It was a clash between the austere black and white vision of the Wahhabi Gulf states and the vibrant cultural heritage of the Arab Levant.
And the ultimate irony is that one of the states that helped defend that vibrant, plural
was Iran.
Which is, it is a theocracy, but it's always described as the mullah's regime.
That has 60,000 Jews living in total security and with one representative in their parliament, but.
Yeah.
Meanwhile,
they have
Turkey,
pluralism.
Israel,
Yeah,
Saudi
this is not to
Arabia.
dispute that Iran is a theocracy and has issues, but Iran also went to bat and put its own resources and citizens on the line to defend one of the only countries in the region that remains a secular, vibrant, tapestry
So
for these different religious groups.
You just have to really know the Middle East and spend time there to see how precious Syria is culturally. I'm not talking about politically.
I mean, that is their cultural identity. That is the spirit of the nation, is that rosary, is that mosaic. It's this bastion where there's so much just physical history for each of the Abrahamic religions, particularly Christianity and Islam, and they were able to practice and exist there together. They're very proud of the religious history. It's their national identity, and all of these Christian sites were protected by a Muslim population or government, people that we're supposed to think in the West would be hostile to the existence of churches. But Syria Syria turns the whole war on terror narrative and clash of civilizations narrative on its head, because it shows, first of all, that the United States, when it claims to have been fighting terrorism, was actually supporting the very groups which attacked it on 9/11.
That the U.S. is waging the war on the clash of civilizations.
That the U.S. and its allies, Turkey, Israel, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, they're the ones fueling this clash of civilizations, and that actually a country like Syria was taking care of itself pretty well and allowing for all of these faiths to flourish, for people to... I mean, it's the same thing. Like I heard, I knew growing up in Michigan a few Iraqi nuns who had fled after the war on Iraq. And what I heard in Syria was very similar, where people would say before the war, nobody would ask their neighbor which sect they belonged to. No one thought about it. But then afterwards, it became this really... There was a heightened sense of awareness of where everybody came from and what...
I also remember that Syria used to be a major hub for U.S. students to study Arabic. It was Syria and Jordan.
Well, maybe because of the...
And to go hiking.
Well, yeah, but the dialect too, of course. But Syria was a major hub for...
Damascus University had the finest Arabic programs for English-speaking students.
Also because unlike other countries in the region, I was surprised when I went to Syria. I just was expecting people as their second language to speak French because of the colonial history. But I found out that actually after gaining independence, the Syrian government consciously made the decision to pick English as the second official language, which everybody learned in school, just because they wanted to stick it to the French.
And all right, we got to wrap up soon. There's one point I wanted to mention. You talked about how this, Muslim majority country helped protect the rights of religious minorities. Another point we haven't talked about is the army. This is a conscription-based army, and it's majority a Sunni army, even though if you listen to these...
Sunni genocide.
Yeah, no, if you listen to these brain-dead pundits in the Western media, half of whom are on Gulf payrolls, they refer to it as the Alawite regime, and they're committing Sunni genocide. No, something like 60+% of the army, which is conscription-based, young men, many of them did not choose to join, they were forced to join. The majority of them are Sunni, and many of the leaders of the army are also Sunni. It's not all just Alawites. And like you're saying, these are people who, fought side by side with people of other religions and sects to defend the tapestry of their country. Can you talk about what the experiences of average civilians have been like, whose families, have actually probably been torn apart because of this war, not just because of people being killed, but also they have to send their sons to go fight. This is a conscription army.
Yeah. And, before the war, you would serve 2.5 years. That's it. But, I met a former officer who had served. He was stuck there for 8 years. This is why so many young men are going, out of the country, becoming refugees, is because the army just never lets them out because the
Guardian told me they're all fleeing Assad.
Yeah, no, that's completely bogus. And once you get there, you realize that conscription is a big issue, and it's not, the evil government is conscripting them. Yeah,
what would any country do?
Yeah,
in
how are they going to survive?
The attrition rate was so high; they lost so many men fighting these Wahhabi Contras that you couldn't get let out of the army. They needed manpower. And so you would see martyr photos everywhere you went, over homes, over a bar. There's a neighbor of a bar that we went to, whose son died. And, I got attacked for, tweeting photos of members of the Jafari Brigade who are Shia by, these like douchebag regime changers. And they said that, they're Shia, so they're, foreign fighters backed by Iran who come in from Lebanon. And it's actually completely bogus. Those pictures were in Babtuma, which has a Shia quarter that we walked through and we hung out in. And we went to the shrine of Rokhaya, the daughter of Imam Hussein there, which would have been looted and destroyed if the insurgents had taken over.
Blown up.
Yeah, blown up, whatever. But, these guys they were from a Shia militia that fought directly under the command of the Syrian army, and they had Syrian flags on their martyr photos. But the point is that everybody pitched in across sectarian lines to basically save the state. And then the other thing you see everywhere, which is sort of cliched, like if we had been like the Vice media crew going in there, we would have shown constantly, is posters of Assad everywhere in sunglasses. And like Assad, when you see him talk, he's an utterly unremarkable guy, which kind of works in his favor because you can't pigeonhole him as like this eccentric Sacha Baron Cohen dictator like Gaddafi or something. He's sort of, he's
mild-mannered. He dresses like Western clothing.
He comes off like an ophthalmologist. But the way he's portrayed in these pictures is like this battle-hardened war president, this badass. So he's wearing mirror glasses in all the posters, and he's pointing and he's looking tough. But what we learned was that these posters were not prevalent around Syria prior to the war, and they started
not at that level.
Not at that level, and they started kind of spontaneously. Families that were losing their sons in the war who were fighting. Bashar became a symbol of the country.
People put him in front of their businesses, in front of their homes.
You see a lot of it on the back on the back windshield of cars. People have these like nets that they put up of Bashar, sometimes alongside Putin and Nasrallah, but people spontaneously put him up everywhere. And you see him in private spaces too, not just at like military checkpoints. But these are families that have lost sons in the war. And we didn't get to go to the coast to like Latakia, but what we heard is that, the martyr posters are much more prevalent there. Obviously those are Alawite areas, but you see it in every area.
The one person that we talked to had also served in the military. He really seemed to believe that the true death count of the Syrian soldiers was much higher than we're led to believe, or that's officially on record. And I just hope that one day we get the full, like a true account.
Because half the guys in his barrack were killed.
Yeah, he said like 5 of his close immediate friends were killed. And so just based on his own experience, if you multiply that by the number of different battalions or whatever you would call it.
He said that there were twins in his barrack and they were murdered on a roadside by their aunt's husband. And they were Alawite twins, but their aunt's husband was Sunni, and he became infected with a lot of the sectarian propaganda that was being pumped in by networks like Al Jazeera, Orient TV and whatnot. And he just decided to kill them one day.
It's like the other guy who we spoke to, who said his apartment was taken over by armed fighters in one of the
Jalal.
Jalal. That was the neighborhood.
No, Jalal was the guy. The neighborhood was Barze.
And he said that his wife, someone who had married into his wife's family, like a cousin, or it was his brother-in-law, sent him a picture from inside his apartment, like with his shit, being like, look at me, man, like sticking it to him. Like people's own family members turned against them that way. And what Max said about the role media, particularly Gulf Qatari funded media, played was really key. A lot of people we spoke to mentioned that, and people were telling us how there were times when Al Jazeera hosts were, for example, saying
Al Arabiya hosts on
both.
Saudi.
They said both. Would say things like Shias are worse than Israelis. Yep. We have to oppose them more than we have to oppose Israel. It's the low. So I mean, we've heard these things before too. Just the level of like racist. It's like puts Fox News to shame what these people were saying.
Yeah, and so you really see not just the physical fragmentation of society where you get to drive through kilometers of areas that have been destroyed, but the psychological fragmentation and the personal fragmentation where everybody my age that I spoke to who is well educated or younger, every single one would say, I'm the only one of my friends who's still in the country. Yeah. Or I only have one friend left in the country. Everybody else is left. Mm-hmm. They would say, Syria has become such a lonely place. So they're having this massive brain drain,
like in Venezuela,
which is affecting society at every level, especially, within the civil service and at the governmental level. So
it's very similar in Venezuela. I mean, it's just brutal economic war.
That's an intended result, again, of economic war, because they know that even people who believe in the political project or believe in the national identity at a certain point think, wow, I only have one life to live. I have a family. I'm in my 30s. I have to do what's best for them, and I have to go somewhere else where I could at least work and, receive money that's worth something. That is an intended result of U.S. economic war, financial terrorism.
And wrapping up here, you mentioned a few things I want to address. One, the death toll. What's interesting is that this has gotten so little coverage in the mainstream corporate media, but even pro-opposition UK government-funded so-called monitoring group, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which, we don't need to go into the history, but it's run by a Syrian opposition supporter who has lived in England for nearly 20 years, since the early 2000s, and has run this operation out of his house in Coventry, England, Rami Abdulrahman. But he's more of a slightly more impartial observer than some of the other psychotic opposition fanatics like the Syrian Network for Human Rights, which is, we don't need to talk about. But even the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, the shady group, even they acknowledged that the death toll in the war, which they estimated at over 300,000, includes around 100,000 pro-government fighters, around 1/3 of the deaths, 100,000 so-called rebels, and 100,000 civilians. So even they acknowledge, this pro-opposition group funded by the British government, that at the very least, about the same number of so-called rebels killed is equal to the number of pro-government fighters.
I mean, anytime you see a regime change operation and the death toll discussed, you'll hear a cumulative death toll by some regime change supporter, some whack job on the floor of Congress, and they'll say 350 people died in Nicaragua under the watch of Daniel Ortega.
Or Venezuela during the violent Guaidó.
And how many were killed by the opposition?
Right, but you'll never see the context, which is a breakdown of how many the opposition killed.
And usually they kill at least half, if not more.
At least 50-50, if not more. And I think in Syria it was like at least half, maybe less, but
I mean, it's true that the government killed more civilians.
Yeah, I mean, they had the power to do so, But
Well, also, how if you're bleeding so many people fighting the ground war, because they would, like you mentioned, these tactics that the jihadi groups, the Salafi jihadis were using. So if you send in
was
your ground
crazy.
troops and they bleed you 20, 30 soldiers every time you
Right.
fight, how are you supposed to fight? The way you fight is
With
with
air
airstrikes.
yeah, with Vietnam era weapons,
Right.
which aren't
Yeah.
that precise.
And
So
then this whole barrel
anyway,
bomb thing, it's like the Syrian government didn't choose to use barrel bombs. In fact, there was a joke that often said, well, we'll use better quality weapons if you give
Right.
them to us.
Well,
Then
It's
Russia,
the same thing Hamas
then Russia
says.
came in and they didn't
Yeah.
need barrel bombs anymore. And
Yeah.
then
Well,
that
it's the same thing
became the
Hamas
issue.
says. It's like you always attack us for using these primitive weapons. Give us better weapons.
Well,
We'll use them.
the strongest
Indiscriminate rocket fire. Like, well, let's discriminate. Give us some smart bombs. You know what smart bombs are, by the way? Is they only kill Arabs. So they're
Oh,
smart,
okay.
right?
Yeah, there you go.
no, they only kill enemy combatants.
But the point is that so we never hear the story of the families of the more than 100,000 pro-government fighters, many of whom were conscripted, and also some of whom volunteered. There were a lot of Syrians who volunteered to fight ISIS, to fight Al-Qaeda, to fight these groups. But you can't even talk about them, yet alone their families who have been ripped
No, they're
apart.
fascists. Remember, they're like these white people, these weird white kids. I don't even fucking get it. Like,
Who make Idlib their profile photo.
yeah, they like decided to adopt Syria as a cause. Like, why can't you adopt Palestine? It's like a much better cause. It's much more pure. They don't have a state. They're like, they're just this oppressed, destroyed people that like have been resisting for 70 years, and you can't adopt them. You have to adopt the Syrian, Wahhabi militias as your cause. And they demonize people in a post-colonial Arab state, like, because they're on the government side, as fascists, and anyone who tries to tell their story gets demonized as a Nazi by these weird white kids who like
who are
have no
whitewashing
connect-
the actual
have
fascists.
no
The actual
connection to the Middle
fascists
East.
are Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I'm sorry, I'm not using Islamo-fascists. This is not the same thing as these Islamophobic idiots who, by the way, supported the war in Syria. Daniel Pipes, all these neocons, these Islamophobes, they supported the war in Syria because Islamophobia is the flip side of these people.
reinforces
of
their whole
imperialism
worldview.
who support the actual Islamists. They're the ones who support these Salafi jihadi groups. So
They want all ethno-states. But to
So
your-
Sam Harris, for instance, we wrote an article at The Gray Zone. Sam Harris went on this long
and
rant.
Majid Nawaz.
Yeah, with Majid Nawaz.
No, he gets to be his true self and support the.
Majid Nawaz joined this Islamist extremist group because they were supporting the Bosnian Mujahideen in the war in Yugoslavia. So anyway, it's all the same politics. But the point at the end of the day is that the actual anti-fascists are the ones who, regardless of the government, these are average people putting their lives on the line to defend a secular state that provides equal rights for all religious and ethnic minorities and women. We didn't even talk about women. Like, how are women faring in Saudi Arabia? How are women? I mean, Islamophobes like to mention that point, but it's real.
I mean,
women,
I was building
women have
up to
equal
that
rights in
before.
Syria.
I was building up to it before, and it's like you're not allowed to say it in left circles, partly because of the way that Islamophobes talk, because of the way Israeli Hasbarists talk. But women in Syria, they walk around in the old city in like skimpy dresses at night, drinking and doing what they please, and there's like a hookup scene
not
there.
that that's necessarily like
It doesn't mean that. Yeah, it doesn't mean that their government is superior, but there's entire parts of the middle.
no, I mean, like, it actually does mean that their government is superior to Saudi Arabia's.
It means that it's superior to Saudi for sure. But this
or
is
to
something.
anything that the women experience in rebel-held territories. I mean, the people, even if you're not a woman, but just a person, like the people who we spoke to who were living under Jaish al-Islam, and they said they couldn't dance or listen to music. Like, if people are going to be oppressed, women are going to be on they're going to be getting the shortest end of the stick. They're going to be getting the heaviest repression because they.
This is something that Samantha Power wanted to take away. That's my point. Is that Samantha Power and Anne-Marie Slaughter and Hillary Clinton and Susan Rice wanted to take that away from those women. They were happy to take that away, and they would have never stood for that in their own societies. And it just highlights that hypocrisy. It really hits home when you see it. And just hundreds of meters away was under the control of Zahran Alouche, this fanatic who paraded Alawite women around in cages on the back of pickup trucks and wanted to ethnically cleanse religious minorities. So it just gets so real when you're there, and these fake feminists, R2P, humanitarian interventionists, like Samantha Power, who's on book tour right now. Like, if you're watching this, if you're still paying attention to this, find out where Samantha Power is on book tour and like ask why she's allowed to walk around in public still. Like, why is she able to have an audience still? Why isn't she confronted on this base hypocrisy? And by the way, you know, any like hardcore moderate rebel listener will know that there was a concerted attempt to prevent me from doing my book launch at Politics and Prose in Washington, D.C., which is the main kind of establishment bookstore in town where you do your book launch, because the Syrian American Council and the Syrian regime change lobby and a lot of the people we're talking about right now didn't like the way they appeared on the pages of the book, and they just tried to shut me down. But Nikki Haley will be appearing at Politics and Prose, another, you know, fake feminist who wanted to...
Is she even a fake feminist, though?
Yeah, she plays that card.
I don't even think she's a feminist, like, pretends to be a feminist.
Yeah, I guess she kind of like
She's basically like an ultra-conservative.
Yeah, she kind of wants to like shoot abortion doctors. And so anyway, she's appearing at Politics and Prose, and there's no outcry at all. Like, there's nothing. So I'm obviously a worse war criminal than Nikki Haley, who presided over the slaughter in Yemen. I mean, it just says it all for me.
All right, well, we'll have to wrap up here. 2 quick points. I was going to say on the women thing, you know, women's nightlife and stuff, that's a whole other thing. But I was going to say also, there are women in the Syrian government. How many women do you see in the Saudi government,
actually,
in the Qatari
having
government?
access to healthcare and education, these are all core class issues which women benefit from if there's a state that can provide. Like, women benefit if there's a state.
No, and I know Islamophobes and Zionists use this talking point. Of course, they always do it to demonize resistance struggles in Palestine, Yemen, and elsewhere. But let's be real. Syria, of all the countries in the region, women probably have the most equal rights in Syria. And that should be something that should be celebrated. Just because Zionists and Islamophobes
in Libya,
use it
they used to
demonize. Exactly. And then the other point I was going to say is, look, people have made this analogy, and it's a bit heavy-handed, and it's not one-to-one, but during the U.S. Civil War, the evil dictator Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and passed forced conscription, and they conscripted thousands and thousands of people to go fight in this massive
and a lot of them just
bloodletting.
Died
Yeah.
like...
And what percentage? Something like 5% or maybe higher of the U.S. population was killed in the Civil War. Not even to mention the so-called Revolutionary War, but of course in domestic U.S. wars, it's always whitewashed. Everything can be justified. The ethnic cleansing and genocide. And this is not whataboutery. This is the point that when you have a massive civil war, you have massive bloodletting on all sides, and that's fucking horrible, and that's why we should oppose war. But we're not the ones who imposed this war in Syria in the first place. The ones who imposed the war in Syria were the ones who wanted regime change by any means necessary. So it's kind of this gaslighting situation where anti-war voices, journalists, activists, academics, researchers, anyone who just is concerned about peace, are the ones who are the ones who have to defend themselves as if they were the ones who wanted the war. They're not the one. No, right. The people sitting in these DC think tanks that are funded by Gulf.
That's why Nir Rosen gets attacked. It's all in the framing. It's like he stopped the attempt to remove the guy who was gassing everybody to death. No, he actually helped negotiate a de-escalation of the conflict.
Of this brutal war.
Have you noticed that like people aren't dying as much as they were before? Like, isn't that the point? No, the point is regime change by any means necessary for these psychopaths.
And you mentioned Samantha Power. We now know that she recently said in an interview while promoting her new book, by the way, in this new memoir, which is some 400 pages, she doesn't mention Yemen at all. She played a leading role. I know I mentioned this earlier. It's not whataboutery. Meanwhile, while this war in Syria is happening, the worst humanitarian catastrophe on earth is being unleashed thanks to the U.S., Britain, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE on Yemen, the poorest country in the region, where there's actual genocide, essentially. I mean, it's not the definition, but there's a genocidal war and that they're starving millions of people to death, and very little discussion of it until more recently for partisan reasons. Meanwhile, Samantha Power, who played a key role in that war, doesn't mention it in her memoir. And while she's promoting her memoir, she says, oh, well, I agree. I disagreed with Obama. Obama was wary of overthrowing the Syrian government directly. She said in an interview, I wanted us to intervene militarily directly to overthrow Assad.
Nothing exposes the fraud of the regime changers who tried to shut down my book talk more than the fact that they're not out there protesting Samantha Power's book tour and Nikki Haley's book tour. And again, I mean, I think we talked, I introduced this in an earlier episode, but I really would like Samantha Power and Anne-Marie Slaughter to team up for a podcast called Power and Slaughter. Because that really sums up what the
presidential campaign.
Yeah, Power and Slaughter, them together.
All right. Well, Anya, the final word on Syria. Just reflecting your elevator speech. How was the trip for you? And you told me off camera recently that it kind of changed your life in a way that it was incredible, an incredible experience.
Well, it's an extremely beautiful country, and it's, on one hand, extremely inspiring to go there and see. I was surprised, like I said, the level to which there wasn't government control, but also just normal life in the areas that are liberated. People are going out and drinking and hanging out in areas in Damascus, but people are also just trying to survive amidst an economic war, and that's really inspiring. You know, you meet these people, and as we said, everyone that you talk to has some a horror story really about their experience during the war, and it's uplifting in a way, but it's also extremely dark. It's hard to remove the fact that you can see a neighborhood and be like, wow, it's the extremists came so close to taking this over and destroying it, and it's so beautiful, and I'm so grateful it's still here. And then you think about the sacrifice that the people made in order for that to happen. And then you remember how much of the country was destroyed for no reason other than outside powers decided to wage an illegal war in order to destroy this country, which really did. It really represented in the region a mosaic, the whole thing that we talked about regarding the religious rosary and the coexistence, but also what it meant for the Arab world as a strong state, one of the few, the only one that's still left over from the era of Nasser, this idea that there could be a strong Arab identity that was independent of religion.
And colonialism.
And NATO.
And yeah, well, that's colonialism in the region, and that's why they wanted to destroy it. And so much of it was destroyed. We can't forget about that, even when we reflect on the fact that the fight of the Syrian people is very admirable and inspiring. It's still just, we have to feel a certain level of responsibility for the fact that a really beautiful country still was destroyed to a degree, and so many people died.
Yeah, Max, final words?
Well, I was struck by how much we see Jerusalem promoted to us as this tourist site to see the center of civilization. But when you get to Damascus, you realize that there's so much history there as well. And you go to the Umayyad Mosque, which was built on a basilica honoring as a shrine John the Baptist.
He's there.
And John the Baptist's head is said to be there. And just a few feet away is the tomb of Saladin, the conqueror, who defended Jerusalem and defended this area against the Crusaders. And next to Saladin, which is one of the most moving experiences for me, was the tomb of Mohammed Ramadan Said al-Bouti. If you study Islamic history, if you know anything about Islamic scholarship today, then you know who al-Bouti is. He was considered sort of a quietist, also someone who adopted themes of liberation, theology, and tolerance. And he was just a towering figure in modern day Sunni Islam. And he opposed the insurgency after a few months, he saw where it was going. He supported actually the Egyptian uprising, but he opposed what was happening in Syria because he saw it becoming sectarian, tearing people apart. He was portrayed in Western media as, a sadist and, his tool. But ultimately he was proven right. And he was assassinated while teaching a course along with 48 of his students. 48 of his students in a mosque in Damascus were blown up by an al-Nusra suicide bomber. He was killed with the Quran in his hand, and the Quran, has a bloodstained hand on it, and he lies next to Saladin. It just shows how this proxy war was an attack on everyone, and especially on the the most erudite and prestigious symbols of Syria and its heritage. And you walk through the Umayyad Mosque and you look at these minarets, and you remember that the minaret of the Umayyad Mosque in Aleppo was in fact destroyed by the insurgents. They dug tunnels under it and used it as fortification and looted it, and it meant nothing to them. It meant nothing to them. It meant nothing to the CIA. It meant nothing to the State Department. It meant nothing to Prince Bandar, who armed these psychopaths. It meant nothing to the Emir of Qatar, and it meant nothing to Erdogan, who claims to speak on behalf of the Ummah and is doing this big event here in New York where he literally is claiming to speak on behalf of the Ummah with all of these big Muslim public figures. It just makes you so angry. That was when the first time that I really had what Clarissa Ward described as spasms of rage. And these people should just go see it, and I don't know how they're going to not be ashamed of themselves.
Well, I said this to Alex Rubinstein because he interviewed...
Maybe narcotics are involved.
Yeah,
maybe helping to ease the
my question I would say, why aren't... She should get psychedelics involved. She should open the doors of perception and, really get on a deeper vibration and take the red pill.
Read some Huxley.
Because she's obviously such a repressed square. She's stuck in sector L7 in corporate media. Whatever.
All right, Anya, you were saying?
What I mentioned to Alex Rubinstein from Mint Press when he interviewed all of us about our experience there was that the first time we drove into Damascus during the day, I saw this, and it's stunningly gorgeous, well-organized, super beautiful city. There's a giant, massive Syrian flag waving over it. And I just thought, if the people who we are fighting with on Twitter every day, or the people who control Washington had their way, that flag would actually be replaced with an Al-Qaeda flag or a black ISIS flag over the oldest capital in the world. And that was really what the fight for Syria was about. And so that's why I take no shame in stating my position. And everybody who wants to come at us and say we're apologists for whatever government or that we were on some genocide tour, it's just I saw it for myself. I don't need their approval, and anybody who has the opportunity should go see it for themselves. And I hope that one day Syria will be in a place where all of the people of the world who would rightfully want to visit it as a destination can go and see how incredible it is, and can realize how grateful we should be that it was defended.
Well, that's a good note to end on. I'm Ben Norton with Max Blumenthal and Anya Parampil. We were talking about their recent trip to Syria, and you can find their reporting. They'll do some print reports at the Gray Zone, and also we're working on editing together a video documentary that you can find at thegrayzone.com. That's Gray Zone with an A. And this is Moderate Rebels. You can support us at Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Moderate Rebels. And thanks, like always, for listening. We'll have a lot more great content like this coming soon. And we're out.
Do you have a closing duet?